Let's make my Petal Breeze quilt pattern using a layer cake. Layer cakes are 10-inch squares, and for this pattern you will need 42 10-inch squares, which will yield you a 48-inch by 56-inch quilt. If you use 80 10-inch squares, then you will yield a twin-size quilt measuring at 64 inches by 80 inches, just to give you a few more options. With each layer cake 10-inch square, you will first cut a 5-inch by 10-inch rectangle, then two 5-inch squares, and with one of those 5-inch squares, you are going to cut at a 45-degree diagonal twice in both directions. And that's it. You'll just repeat this step to every single 10-inch square for the quilt size that you are making. Once you have everything cut, we will sew everything back together again. And first we are going to select 4 different prints for your hourglass block, and we are going to sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving you with a 4-inch quilt block. Now take your time as we are sewing and working with the bias. Now this is a great introduction to sewing on the bias for beginners because at the end we will square everything up. So go ahead and sew all your triangles together to complete your Scrappy hourglass block. Once all of your Scrappy hourglass blocks are completed, we are going to sew a 5-inch square on top of each one. Now it will be longer than needed, but that is fine. Just go ahead and line up the left side and sew it together. That way at the end we will once again square everything up. Now we will sew the 5-inch by 10-inch rectangle to the left side of the block, and once again it will be longer than needed. Once your block is complete, you will take a square ruler and square your block up to a 8.5-inch square. Now I chose to sew everything together this way since we are working on the bias. That way we can trim each block once instead of multiple times. This will of course save us some time when we're piecing everything together. So go ahead and repeat until you have made enough for the quilt size you've selected. Once all of your blocks are made, you will lay them out in a 6 by 7 block layout while rotating each block 90 degrees, or in a 8 by 10 block layout for the twin size quilt. Then as always, sew your blocks together to form rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete your quilt top. And here is what my Petal Breeze quilt pattern looks like all finished. For the backing, I am using a print within the collection. Then for the thread choice, I am going with glide threads in the color Mercury. And here is what my Petal Breeze quilt pattern looks like all quilted. Once again, one layer cake will yield you a 48-inch by 56-inch quilt. And if you use 2 layer cake bundles and instead make a total of 80 quilt blocks while placing them in the 8 by 10 block layout, you will yield an extra large twin size quilt measuring at 64 inches by 80 inches, just to give you a few more options. But if you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.